Hi guys, welcome back. Welcome to the FSX 404 channel. Today we're going to discuss something we haven't discussed before, or we haven't gone into detail before, which is a missed approach. Now, I've read out some missed approach procedures before, after we've done approach plates, but we've never really discussed them. So what are we supposed to do during that missed approach? How do we do it? Well, today we're going to go over that. For this video, I've actually chosen a request to do a VOR runway 15 approach into Syracuse Hancock International Airport, KSYR. And this one is actually one of the more simple ones. There's a lot more complicated ones out there. But let's get into this approach plate and let's brief it as we would with the approach and everything else. And then we'll go into a missed approach, and then we'll go into what we'll do during the missed approach and after the missed approach. So the first thing we're going to look at is the name, of course, the VOR runway 15. So the only thing we need for this approach is to have 2 VORs and a timer. Now, they do give us distances here, as they usually do. So if we have a DME, we can actually use a DME. But the DME is not needed. And because we're using the Airbus 320 for this approach, we will have a DME. So I will use the DME, I will use timing, do it both ways, and I will also use triangulation, which they give us over here. After we look at the name, the next thing we're going to look at is the IAF, the initial approach fix. And this one has 2. The first IAF is the Syracuse VOR. And if we look at the Syracuse VOR, we can see that it has a bold racetrack around it. And you guys should know what that means by now. What that means is we need to do a procedure turn once we reach the VOR, or the IAF in this point. So depending on where we're coming from, we will do a procedure turn. Now, the second IAF for this approach is IAF point called Liaison. Now, from Liaison, we're going to fly a heading of 114 to the Syracuse VOR, which is also another IAF. But if we look closely over here, it says 2000 no PT. What that means is, if we're coming from this point, from IAF Liaison to the Syracuse VOR, we don't have to do a procedure turn. No procedure turn. So, from point Liaison, we can just fly to the VOR, and then we can just depart the VOR on a radial of 131 from the VOR for our final approach without having to do a procedure turn. So you have to be very careful in these cases. If we use Syracuse VOR as our IAF, initial approach fix, where we start the approach, we're going to have to do a procedure turn. But if we're coming from Liaison IAF to the Syracuse VOR, we won't have to do it. And that is always noted as no PT. If we look at the altitudes, we are coming at 2,000 feet, and we're going to maintain 2,000 feet until we reach Syracuse VOR. What's going to happen to the Syracuse VOR? Of course, we're coming on a heading of 114. As we overfly the Syracuse VOR, we're going to intercept a radial of 131 from the Syracuse VOR, and we're going to do a step down descent down to a decision altitude, which in this case is 880 feet. This is a very simple approach. We're just flying a radial from the VOR until we see the runway. Once we pick up the runway, we'll line up with it visually, because we're not lined up 100% with the runway, so we'll line up visually and we'll land. But in this case, we're going to do a missed approach on purpose, just to show you what we do during a missed approach and how the missed approach is done. Another thing to look at is what is our missed approach point? Our missed approach point is 4.7 miles from the VOR or the VOR. That means if we have a DME and we're at 4.7 miles from the VOR on a radial of 131 from the VOR, we're going to do a missed approach. Because we don't need a DME for this approach, we also have times from our final approach fix, which is the VOR-TAC. That's the little X denotes the final approach fix. So we have times from the final approach fix to the missed approach point. If we look at the knots, we have 60, 90, 120, 150, 180. This is all ground speed. This is not indicated airspeed. And then underneath, we have the times that it's going to take us from the VOR, or the final approach fix, to the missed approach point. Since we're flying an Airbus 320, we're going to be flying at a ground speed of approximately 150 knots. So our timing will be 1 minute and 53 seconds. So after we overfly the VOR, the final approach fix, we will start a timer. And if by 1 minute and 53 seconds we don't see the runway or the runway lights, we will do a missed approach. In this case, we'll have a pretty clear day, so we'll do a missed approach on purpose. But we'll still do the timing just to see how it works out. So the next thing we have to know is, what do we need to do for our missed approach? If we go up right here, it says missed approach, climbing left turn to 3000 via Syracuse radial of 111 to Fayette, which is 11.7 miles DME, and hold. So after we do a missed approach, we're going to do a left turn to intercept a radial of 111 from the Syracuse VOR to a point Fayette. Point Fayette is 11.7 miles from the VOR. Since we don't need a DME for this approach, we can also find out what Fayette is if we triangulate. As long as we're on a radial of 111 from the Syracuse VOR, and we intercept a radial of 357 from the Georgetown VOR 117.8, we know that we are at the point Fayette. So we will be at point Fayette at 3,000 feet, and we will hold at 3,000 feet. Now the next thing is, what are we going to do for a hold? Well, the first thing we're going to do for a hold is a procedure turn to get us into that holding pattern. Procedure turns pop up all the time, so we need to know them automatically. So the first thing we need to know is which area we're coming from, so we know which procedure turn to do to enter this holding pattern. For some of you guys that have been following me for a while and you have seen my other tutorials, you know that I have a procedure turns tutorial that's pretty nice and explains everything. I'll do this quickly over here, but if any of you guys needs refreshing, you go down in the description, I'll post a link to the procedure turn tutorial. So we're coming to the point Fayette on a heading of 111. Now let's split this holding pattern into the three areas, because as you remember from before, depending from which area we're coming from, it depends which procedure turn we're going to do. So the first thing we're going to do at the point Fayette, now the point Fayette is the fix of the hold. So the first thing we're going to do for this holding pattern is we're going to extend our inbound leg from the point Fayette or the fix into infinity. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to draw a perpendicular line to the inbound leg over the fix. The third thing we're going to do is we're going to rotate this perpendicular line 20 degrees clockwise. Now if you remember, if the holding pattern is a standard right turn pattern, we're going to rotate this line 20 degrees clockwise. And at this point, we're going to have the three areas. The biggest area is always a direct procedure turn. The middle area, or the middle biggest area, is always a parallel procedure turn. And the smallest area is always a teardrop procedure turn. But in this case, we're coming exactly on the line between the middle and the smallest area. What does this mean? Well, this means that we can choose to do either one. We can choose to do a teardrop procedure turn and come back and start the hold, or we can also do the parallel turn and come back to the fix and start our hold. In this case, we're going to keep it simple, and we're just going to do a parallel procedure turn, meaning we're going to fly 2 minutes on a heading of 111 from the fix. We're going to do a half standard rate turn for airliners to a heading that is 30 degrees more than the heading to the VOR, which is 291. So we're going to turn to a heading of 261. We're going to intercept the heading of 291 to the VOR, and we're going to fly back to the fix. That is going to be our procedure turn to enter the holding pattern. Now, how do we do a holding pattern? I've gone over this a little bit in my tutorial, but over here we're actually going to hold for one turn. For this hold, we're going to do 1 minute legs, or 1 minute outbound, 1 minute inbound legs. Because these are airliners and we cannot turn them into standard rate turns, we're going to use half standard rate turns. That means our turns are going to be 2 minutes. As we reach the fix, the point Fayette, we're going to do a half standard rate turn to a heading of 111. Once we reach a heading of 111, we'll start a timer. We'll fly out for 1 minute. Once we have flown on a heading of 111 for 1 minute, we'll start another right half standard rate turn and intercept a heading of 291 to the VOR again, and we'll fly back to the fix. If we were going to do 5 holds, then we'd do the same thing over again. We'll start a half standard rate turn, fly out for 1 minute, another half standard rate turn, back to the fix. And we'll do that 5 times. But for this video, I'm only going to do it once because the video is going to be long enough as it is. So for us, what's going to happen after we come back to the fix, the point Fayette? Once we come back to the point Fayette, we're going to fly back to our IAF. We're going to choose a closer one, so we're going to fly back to the IAF Syracuse VOR. Now what's going to happen once we fly to the IAF Syracuse VOR? IAF Syracuse VOR has a bold racetrack, so guess what? We need to do another procedure turn. So we're going to do this all over again. We're going to extend our inbound leg to infinity. We're going to draw a perpendicular line. We're going to rotate the perpendicular line 20 degrees clockwise because this is a standard right turn racetrack. And that should give us our 3 areas. The biggest one is a direct entry, the middle one is a parallel entry, and the smallest one is a teardrop entry. So as you can see, we're coming back to the IAF in the smallest area. That means once we reach the Syracuse VOR, we're going to do a teardrop procedure turn, and then we're going to come back to the IAF and then do the rest of the approach. One more thing to remember is that over here we're holding at 3,000 feet. By the time we reach the IAF Syracuse, we need to be at 2,000 feet. So during our flight from Fayette to Syracuse VOR, we're going to descend from 3,000 to 2,000 feet. We're going to do our procedure turn at 2,000 feet, and then we'll do the rest of the approach. Now, I hope some of you guys remember how to do a teardrop procedure turn. Once we reach the Syracuse VOR, we'll fly a heading that is 30 degrees offset from our outbound heading. Our outbound heading here is 311. That means that we're going to fly a heading of 281 for 2 minutes. So once we reach the Syracuse VOR, we'll fly a heading of 281 for 2 minutes. We're going to do a half standard rate turn, come back and intercept a heading of 131 to the Syracuse VOR. This is all going to happen at 2,000 feet. Of course, as we overfly the second time, we're already going to be on a heading of 131 to the VOR, so we'll just continue on a radial of 131 from the VOR. We're going to start a timer, and we're going to start a descent down to 880 feet, which is our decision altitude. Once we pick up the runway visually, we'll make minor adjustments and we'll line ourselves up with the runway and land. Now for this approach, as I said before, we're going to use the Airbus 320. We're actually going to use the Wilco Airbus 320. We're going to start this approach after overflying the Point Lysan a few miles away from the Syracuse VOR on a heading of 114 to the Syracuse VOR, and then we'll do the rest of the approach, the missed approach, the hold, the flight back, the procedure turn, and then the final approach again. So let's get in the airplane and let's fly this approach. We're inside the airplane right now. We're a few miles away from the Syracuse VOR. We're at 2,000 feet. We're flying from the IAF Lysan to the Syracuse VOR on a heading of 114. In VOR 1, we have put Syracuse VOR 117.0 on a heading of 114. In VOR 2, we have put the Georgetown VOR 117.8, and we're going to use VOR 2 for triangulation. Now I'm going to do this flight both ways. I'm going to do this flight using triangulation and timing, and I'm also going to use the DME for this flight. So we can actually do both. We can choose to do the triangulation and timing, or we can choose the DME, whichever one's easier for you. As long as our airplane is equipped with the DME, we can use it. Now there are a few things that are going to happen once we reach the Syracuse VOR. We're going to depart the Syracuse VOR for our final approach heading of a 131, and that's going to be a radial of 131 from the Syracuse VOR. That's our final approach. Now I haven't gone into this much detail before, but there are certain things that are going to happen after we overfly the VOR. There's an acronym for this that we pilots use, and it's called the 5 T's. The first T is we're going to turn first, we're going to time second, we're going to twist third, we're going to adjust the throttle, that's the fourth, and last we're going to talk. Now in Microsoft Flight Simulator, we're really not going to talk, but we're still going to use those principles to do these approaches. Okay, so we're getting pretty close to the VOR. We're going to do the first T, we're going to turn. As soon as we're in our turn, we're going to start the timer, do the second T, we're going to time. The third thing is we're going to do a twist. We're going to twist the VOR to a heading of 131. The fourth thing is we're going to adjust the throttle for a final approach. And the fifth thing would be we would say Syracuse Tower, Airbus 320 on the VOR 15 approach inside the VOR. And the tower would say Airbus 320, clear to land, runway 15. Also, as we overflew the VOR, we have started our descent to 880 feet. Now on this one, we're going to go down to 880 feet, and we're going to maintain 880 feet because we're going to do a missed approach. But obviously we can see the runway. Usually we would adjust our heading, we would line up with the runway, and we would land. But because we're going to do a missed approach here, we're going to maintain our radial of 131 from the VOR. Now there are a few things that are going to happen for a missed approach. The very first thing that needs to happen for a missed approach is we need to pitch the airplane up. Before we do anything else, we need to pitch the airplane up. The second thing that we need to do is we need to add power. The third thing we need to do is we need to raise our landing gear. The fourth thing we need to do, we can put the flaps up to the third setting. After we have put the airplane into this climb, then in this case we're going to start a left turn to intercept a radial of 111 from the Syracuse VOR that's going to take us to our holding fix, the Point Fayette. Another thing to remember about missed approaches is that if we choose to do the missed approach before our missed approach point, we can climb the airplane, we can put the airplane into a climb, but we cannot start the turn. We can only start the turn after our missed approach point. So we can start a climb before our missed approach point, but we cannot start the turn before our missed approach point. Okay, we can look at the timing. The timing is getting up there. We're going to do a missed approach at 153. Here's 153. Okay, we're going to pitch the airplane up. We're going to add the power. We're going to raise the landing gear. We're going to raise the flaps to the third setting. And we're going to start our turn to intercept a heading of 111 from the VOR. Now, as soon as we have started our turn, we can do our 5 T's. We don't have to time, so we can forget the second T. We can twist the VOR to a heading of 111. That's the radial we want to take us to our fix. We already have the power set for a climb, and the last thing we would do is the last T we would talk. Syracuse Tower, Airbus 320 is going missed. On our altitude bug, we're going to put 3,000 feet, just as a reminder. That's where we're going to be at for the hold, at 3,000 feet. We're going to maintain 180 knots for our hold. Okay, here comes the radial of 111 from the Syracuse VOR. Let's start turning to intercept a radial of 111 from the Syracuse VOR. And as we remember from the approach blade briefing, we know that our fix, the point Fayette, is 11.7 miles from the Syracuse VOR, or we can triangulate it by being on a radial of 111 from the Syracuse VOR and intercepting a radial of 357 from Georgetown VOR, because we have already put in the Georgetown VOR in a VOR 2. Now, once we reach the fix, once we reach the point Fayette, again, we're going to do the 5 T's. We're going to turn. Obviously, we don't have to turn because we're just going to fly a heading of 111 for 2 minutes. We're going to start the timer. The third thing is twist. We're not going to twist. We're going to fly this radial for another 2 minutes. The fourth T is the throttle. We're going to adjust it to maintain 180 knots for a holding pattern. And the last T is we would talk. We would tell the ATC Airbus 320 over the fix, starting the procedure turn. .7 miles, radial 357 from Georgetown VOR. We don't have to turn. We're going to do the second T. We're going to start a timer. We don't have to twist the VOR this time. We're going to do the fourth T. We're going to adjust the throttle to make sure that we're at 180 knots for the hold. And the last T is talk. We would call the ATC and tell the ATC Airbus 320 over the fix, starting the procedure turn. Now what we're going to do is now we're going to fly this heading for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, we're going to start a half standard rate turn to the left to a heading of 261, so we intercept a heading of 291 back to the VOR. This is the procedure turn. This is the parallel procedure turn. The half standard rate turns, I've gone over this before. We can either use a flight director if we know how to use it, or for airliners, we're going to keep it between 15 and 25 degrees of bank, and that should work out because none of these are exact, plus the winds are pushing us around. For 180 knots, I'm going to keep about a 20-degree bank, and that should work out pretty nice. Now, once we get to 2 minutes, we're going to do the 5 T's again. We're going to turn. We don't have to time this time. We're going to twist the VOR to a heading of 291, because that's what we want. We want to fly back to the VOR on a heading of 291. That is our inbound leg of the hold. We're going to adjust our throttle to make sure that we're still at 180 knots. And the last thing is we would talk. At this point, we don't have to talk. We'll talk when we're back over the fix and starting our hold. Okay, so there is 2 minutes. We're going to start our turn. That's the first T. We don't have to time. The next thing is the third T. We're going to twist our VOR to a heading of 291. The fourth T is we're going to adjust the throttle to maintain 180 knots. And the last T would be the talk, but we don't have to talk at this point. All we're doing right now is we're turning to a heading of 261 to intercept a heading of 291 to the VOR. So we're turning past the heading of 291 back to the heading of 261, which is 30 degrees off, to intercept that heading of 291 back to the VOR. We're going to maintain 3,000 feet. We're not going to chase the needle. We're going to fly headings. So now we're just going to fly a heading of 261 until that needle comes back in. And once the needle starts coming back in, then we'll head out on a heading of 291 to intercept that needle and maintain that needle centered. Here's the heading of 261. We're still at 3,000 feet. Our airspeed is 180 knots. We are looking good so far. Now, right now we're pretty far away from the VOR. We're 16.7, 16.6 miles away from the VOR. That means that the needle is not going to move that fast. So we're going to let the needle come back in a little further, and then we're going to start turning to intercept that heading of 291 to the VOR. Okay, so the needle is pretty close in right now. Let's just start a nice gentle turn to intercept that needle, to intercept that heading of 291 to the VOR. Okay, so as we're turning on this heading of 291 to the VOR, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to do the holding pattern. We're going to do one turn around the hold. Now, our hold is going to begin at our fix. Our fix is the point fayette. We already overflew it once, coming this way to do the procedure turn. Now, what we're going to do is, as soon as we're over the fix, we're going to start a half standard rate turn to the right until we reach a heading of 111. We're going to fly a heading of 111 out for 1 minute, because we're going to do 1 minute legs. Then we're going to do a half standard rate turn to the right again to intercept a heading of 291 back to the VOR. And then once we intercept the heading of 291 back to the VOR, it should take us approximately another minute to fly back to the fix. Once we reach the fix, which is 11.7 miles away from the VOR, or on a radial of 357 from Georgetown VOR, the second VOR, we're going to turn. We don't have to time. We don't have to twist. We'll adjust the throttle to make sure whether we're 180 knots. And the last thing we're going to do is the last T, and we're going to talk. We can call up the ATC and tell them Airbus 320 is over the fix, starting the hold. We're going to maintain about 20 to 25 degrees of bank for this turn, and it should take us approximately 2 minutes to do this turn. It doesn't matter, we're not going to time it. The only thing we're worried about is rolling out on a heading of 111. Once we roll out on that heading of 111, we're going to start a timer, and we're going to time our flight on a heading of 111 for 1 minute. That is our 1 minute hold. Alright, a heading of 111 coming in. We're going to roll out. We're going to start a timer. We don't have to twist. We'll adjust the throttle for 180 knots. And we don't have to talk this time. Now, we're going to fly on a heading of 111 for 1 minute. That is a 1 minute hold pattern. at this point we're on the outbound leg of our hold pattern. The next thing that's going to happen is that after 1 minute we're going to start another half standard rate turn back to intercept a heading of 291 back to the VOR. Now when we're doing these holds and with these approaches, maintaining our airspeed as constant as we can. In this case 180 knots is very important. If our airspeed is fluctuating 15 knots up, 15 knots down, this is not going to be very accurate. So we have to maintain this airspeed as constant as we can. Okay, here's 1 minute. Let's start the turn. Let's start a half standard rate turn back to intercept a heading of 291 to the VOR. Now at this point we have the VOR gauge that's going to tell us when we're going to intercept a heading of 291. We're not going to be perfect all the time. There's going to be winds that are going to push us around up in the air. So we're not going to be perfect rolling out every time. This is okay. During your IFR test, during your IFR check ride, you actually have 2 holds until you get it right. That means you get in the first one, you find out how much you're off, you adjust for it in the second one, you find out how much you're off again, and then you should get it right by the third time. We're talking about getting the wins. So it's okay if we're not perfect on the first time or the second time. But as we can see, this one is working out to be pretty good. You can see that the heading of 291 to the Syracuse VOR is coming in pretty nice. So we actually gauged this one right. Now what we're going to do is we're going to time the inbound leg. We're going to find out how long the inbound leg is. We're going to find out how long it takes us to fly the inbound leg, and if it's anything different than 1 minute because the winds have pushed us around on the outbound leg, then we would actually adjust the outbound leg, fly it longer or shorter depending on which way the winds are coming from. That way the inbound leg is exactly 1 minute. The next thing is going to happen for us, we're going to fly right over the fix again at 11.7 miles, radial of 357 from the second VOR, the Georgetown VOR. At that point, we can do another hold just like we did right now, and we can hold for as long as we want. But what we're going to do from this point is we're going to fly back to our IAF. Okay, 1 minute exactly, 11.7, so we hit the hold right on the spot this time. So at this point, we are flying back to the Syracuse VOR. We're going to descend from 3,000 down to 2,000 because remember, we need to be at 2,000 feet to do our approach. I'm going to put the airspeed bug at 165 knots, just as a reminder, because from this point on, we want to fly at 165 knots. And as I said, we're going to go down to 2,000 feet. Okay, we're at 2,000 feet. Let's level off at 2,000 feet. Let's put 2,000 feet on our altitude bug just as a reminder. You should always use these altitude and heading bugs to remind you where you're going, or what altitudes you're going to hold, or what headings you're going to fly. They can help out when things get confusing. Now, the next thing that's going to happen is, over the VOR, we're going to have to do another procedure turn. Because on our approach plate, the racetrack was bold for the Syracuse IAF, Syracuse VOR IAF, we have to do a procedure turn. We didn't have to do it the first time because we came from the point Lyson and there was no procedure turn necessary from that point. But for the second one, we need to do a procedure turn. This time we're going to do a teardrop procedure turn. If we remember from our approach plate briefing, we're going to fly a heading of 281 for 2 minutes. Then we're going to do a half standard rate turn and intercept a heading of 131 back to the VOR. Okay, so now we're getting close to the Syracuse VOR. After we overfly the Syracuse VOR, we're going to head out on a heading of 281 for our procedure turn for 2 minutes. So we're going to do our 5 T's again. We're going to turn, we're going to start the timer, we're going to twist the VOR to a heading of 131, we're going to adjust the throttle for 165 knots, and we're going to talk. We'll tell the ATC over the VOR, starting the procedure turn. Let's put the heading bug of 281 so we're reminded. There goes the VOR. Let's turn. Oops, this is turning the wrong way. Let's turn to a heading of 281. Let's start a timer. Let's do the third T. Let's twist. Heading of 131 on the VOR. That's the heading we want to fly back to the VOR. And that, by the way, will be our final approach heading too. We'll depart the VOR on a radial of 131. We're going to adjust the throttle for 165 knots. And we're going to talk. Airbus 320 over the VOR, starting the procedure turn. So now we're going to fly this heading for 2 minutes. At the end of 2 minutes, we're going to start a half standard rate turn to the right to intercept a heading of 131 back to the VOR. We're still at 2,000 feet. We're still at 165 knots. Okay, we're a little bit too fast. Let's reduce some of the power. Like I said before, for these holds, for these procedure turns, for these approaches, we really want to keep our speed as constant as we can. The more constant we keep our speed, the more accurate our turns are. If we keep changing the speed, we're going to throw the timing off. Two minutes, we're going to start a half standard rate turn to the right, and by the time we roll out of this turn, we should be pretty much on a heading of 131 back to the VOR. If we're not, we'll make little adjustments and we'll establish ourselves on a heading of 131 back to the VOR. But if we've done this right, and if we've done it correctly and maintained the speeds as constant as we could, we should pretty much roll out on a heading of 131 back to the VOR. Okay, our altitude is looking good, our airspeed is looking good, the needle is starting to come in. Okay, the needle is coming in, it's looking good. At this point we're established on a heading of 131, and it looks like we did this one right too. It looks like this is going to work out very nice. As we're getting close to a heading of 131, we're established on a heading of 1312, the VOR. We're at 2,000 feet or close to it, 165 knots. We are looking good. Now the next thing that's left is the final approach. We've already did this before. We're going to overfly the VOR, and then we're going to do the 5 T's. In this case we don't have to turn. In this case we don't have to twist. We're going to time 1 minute and 53 seconds. We're going to adjust the throttle for the descent to maintain an airspeed of 150 knots for the final approach speed. And we're going to talk. We're going to let the tower know that we're inbound on the VOR 15 approach inside the VOR. Also over the VOR, we're going to start a descent. We're going to remember to start a descent, and we're going to put our landing gear down. Okay, we're overflying the VOR. We don't have to turn. We're going to start a timer, 1 minute and 53 seconds. We don't have to twist anything. We're already set up for a radial of 131 from the Syracuse VOR. We're going to adjust the throttle for 150 knots, and we're going to talk. Syracuse Tower, Airbus 320, inbound on the VOR 15 inside the VOR. Our landing gear is down. We're descending down to 880 feet, but we have visual on the runway, so all we're going to do is we're going to make little adjustments to line ourselves up with the runway 15, and we're going to land. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you learned something new today. Take care, and I'll see you guys soon.
1,000. 400. 300. 200. 100. 50. 40. 30. 20. 10.